On a cold March afternoon in 2018, the streets of Salisbury moved at their usual unhurried pace. The cathedral spire cut into a gray English sky. Shoppers drifted between cafes and chain stores, and nothing, at first glance, seemed out of the ordinary. In a small park near the city center, a man and a woman sat together on a bench, unnoticed by most who passed. Within hours, that bench would be cordoned off, sealed beneath plastic sheeting and police tape, and the quiet cathedral city would find itself at the center of an international crisis. The man was Sergei Skripal, the woman, his daughter Yulia. When they were discovered, both were barely conscious, their bodies rigid, their breathing labored. To the first people on the scene, it looked like a medical emergency. Perhaps a drug overdose, a heart attack, some sudden, inexplicable collapse. But the symptoms did not quite fit, and the scale of the response that followed suggested something more sinister. As ambulances arrived and paramedics worked to stabilize the pair, the shadows of an older conflict began to stretch over this modern English town. The Cold War, it seemed, had not entirely ended. It had simply changed its methods. To understand why Sergei Skripal became a target, investigators and journalists traced his story back decades, to a different country and a different flag. Skripal had been a Russian military officer, serving in the GRU, Russia's military intelligence service. In that world of secrecy and deception, he had been recruited by British intelligence, becoming a double agent for MI6. For years, he passed information to the West, betraying Russian operations and networks. Eventually, Russian authorities uncovered his activities. He was arrested, tried for treason, and imprisoned. In most eras, that might have been the end of his story. But in the complex dance of post-Cold War espionage, captured agents sometimes became bargaining chips. After years behind bars, Skripal was released as part of a spy swap between Russia and Western countries, exchanged for Russian agents held abroad. He was resettled in the United Kingdom, given a new life in Salisbury, where he appeared to live quietly under British protection. Neighbors saw an older man walking his dog, shopping, visiting local pubs. Whatever secrets he had once carried seemed, from the outside, to belong to another time. On the morning of March 4th, 2018, that ordinary routine appeared to continue. Yulia Skripal had flown in from Russia to visit her father. They left his home, traveled into the town center, and spent part of the day together. A meal at a restaurant, a drink at a pub, the kind of simple outing that leaves only faint traces on CCTV footage and credit card records. Yet as they moved through Salisbury, someone else's plan was unfolding. Later, witnesses would recall seeing the pair on the park bench, suddenly unwell. Sergei's eyes were glazed, his movements jerky. Yulia was slumped, struggling to breathe. A passing doctor and nurse stopped to help. Emergency services were called. At first, there were no obvious signs of violence. No blood, no visible wounds. The scene was puzzling, but it did not yet resemble a crime. Police and paramedics treated it as a medical incident, securing the area and transporting the Skripals to hospital. Only as doctors confronted a baffling set of symptoms, rapid onset, severe neurological distress, and an unusual resistance to standard treatments, did the question arise. Had they been poisoned? As specialists were called in and the hospital went into a heightened state of alert, attention turned to what kind of substance could cause such rapid and profound collapse. Toxicologists and chemical weapons experts were consulted. When the answer emerged, it was as chilling as it was unexpected. a nerve agent, belonging to a family of compounds developed in the late Soviet era, known collectively as Novichok. These agents had been designed in secret programs, intended to be more potent, more difficult to detect, and harder to counter than earlier nerve agents. They attacked the nervous system with brutal efficiency, disrupting the body's ability to control muscles, breathing, and vital functions. Even at extremely low doses, they could be lethal. Unlike some chemical weapons that evaporate quickly, certain Novichok agents were believed to be persistent, clinging to surfaces, remaining dangerous for extended periods, and capable of being concealed in seemingly ordinary objects. Producing them required advanced facilities, specialized knowledge, and access to precursors tightly controlled under international law. In theory, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which Russia had signed, prohibited the development, stockpiling, and use of such substances. Officially, Russia had declared its chemical weapons program dismantled, yet the forensic evidence from Salisbury pointed toward a weapon that should not have existed in the hands of any state, much less on the streets of an English town. In the days that followed, the local incident became a national emergency. Authorities declared a major incident and a public health alert. Investigators began to retrace the Skripals' movements, examining every place they had visited: the park bench, the restaurant, the pub, the route from their home into the city. Police officers in protective suits established cordons around key locations. Streets were closed, businesses disrupted, and familiar landmarks were suddenly hidden behind barriers and tarpaulins. Specialists in hazardous materials conducted painstaking searches, swabbing surfaces, testing samples, and mapping the spread of contamination. The investigation quickly grew beyond the local police force. Domestic security services, including MI5, joined with foreign intelligence partners to assess what had happened and who might be responsible. Forensic laboratories worked to confirm the exact composition of the nerve agent, comparing it with known signatures from past programs. Step by step, a picture emerged of a targeted attack using a rare and tightly controlled chemical weapon, applied in a way designed to kill without warning. Attention then turned to the question of who had carried out the operation. In a world saturated with cameras, Salisbury's network of CCTV systems provided a starting point. Analysts combed through hours of footage, looking for unfamiliar faces, unusual movements, and patterns that did not fit the routines of local life. Two men began to stand out. Arriving in the country on commercial flights, staying in modest accommodation, traveling to Salisbury on the days surrounding the attack, and making repeated visits to the area near the Skripal home. They were recorded walking through the city, close to the route the Skripals would later take. Their movements, once plotted on a timeline, suggested surveillance and preparation. The names on their travel documents were Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov, identities that, on closer examination, appeared to be aliases. As journalists and open-source investigators joined the hunt, they began to link these cover names to real individuals, officers of the GRU, Russian military intelligence. Passport records, leaked databases, and photographs from Russian sources helped match faces and backgrounds. The pattern that emerged aligned with the assessment of British intelligence. This was not a freelance operation or a criminal gang. It bore the hallmarks of a state-directed mission. Months after the initial attack, long after the Skripals had vanished from public view into secure medical care and protective custody, the nerve agent reappeared in the most tragic of ways. In a nearby town, a man named Charlie Rowley found what appeared to be a sealed perfume box and bottle. To him, it looked like a discarded luxury item, something of value that had been thrown away. He brought it home and later gave it to his partner, Dawn Sturgis. She sprayed the contents on her skin, unaware that the liquid inside was not perfume, but Novichok. Within hours, she fell gravely ill. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and despite intensive treatment, she died. Rowley himself became severely unwell, but survived. The discovery of this contaminated bottle forced investigators to reconsider the scope of the crime scene. What had begun as a targeted assassination attempt had now become a public hazard, with lethal material left in a form that any passerby could have encountered. The legal and moral implications were stark. A weapon of war, deployed in a foreign country, had killed an uninvolved civilian who had no connection to espionage or state conflict. The boundary between covert operation and indiscriminate endangerment had been fatally crossed. As the UK government laid out its findings, attention turned to Moscow. Russian officials issued firm denials, rejecting any involvement and demanding access to evidence and samples. State media amplified alternative explanations. Perhaps the attack had been staged by British authorities or carried out by other actors seeking to frame Russia. Commentators floated conspiracy theories, questioning timelines and motives, sowing doubt about the official narrative. In one widely publicized appearance, the two men identified as Petrov and Boshirov appeared on a Russian television channel, insisting that they were ordinary tourists who had traveled to Salisbury to see its famous cathedral and enjoy the local architecture. Their account, with its oddly specific details and evasive answers, was met with skepticism abroad. Western governments, presented with the UK's intelligence assessments and forensic evidence, largely rejected Russia's explanations.
For many observers, the Skripal case fit into a broader pattern. Suspicious deaths, poisonings, and attacks linked to Russian interests in various countries, using methods that blurred the line between espionage and terrorism. The diplomatic consequences were swift and far-reaching. The British government formally accused Russia of using a military-grade nerve agent on its soil, in violation of international law and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Allies were briefed, and consultations took place within NATO, the European Union, and other forums. In an unusually coordinated response, dozens of Western countries expelled Russian diplomats and suspected intelligence officers from their embassies. In total, more than 100 Russian officials were ordered to leave, in what became one of the largest such expulsions in modern diplomatic history. Russia responded in kind, expelling Western diplomats from its own territory and denouncing the actions as hostile and unfounded. Embassies were thinned, channels of communication strained, and intelligence cooperation, already fragile, was further eroded. The Skripal affair deepened an existing rift between Russia and the West, reinforcing a narrative of confrontation and mistrust that had been building over years of disputes over Ukraine, cyber operations, and election interference. Behind the headlines, the case raised unsettling questions about the persistence of Cold War tactics in a supposedly post-Cold War world. Poison had long been a tool of statecraft, used in clandestine operations where deniability and silence were prized. In the early 21st century, that tradition had not disappeared. The poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London years earlier, using radioactive polonium, had already signaled a willingness to employ exotic and highly dangerous substances on foreign soil. The use of Novichok in Salisbury appeared to follow a similar logic, a message to insiders and defectors that betrayal would be punished, no matter where they sought refuge. Deploying a banned nerve agent carried its own brutal symbolism. It suggested both technological prowess and a certain contempt for international norms, an assertion that red lines could be crossed with limited consequence. Yet such operations were inherently risky. They threatened to escalate tensions, undermine the global taboo against chemical weapons, and invite unpredictable retaliation. For many in Western governments,
The Skripal case became a turning point, a moment when lingering hopes of pragmatic engagement with Russia collided with the reality of an adversary willing to reach across borders with methods once associated with the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Amid the geopolitical drama, the human story continued in quieter, more private ways. Sergei and Yulia Skripal, against the odds, survived. Their recovery was slow and largely hidden from public view, shielded by security measures and medical confidentiality. Their future, where they lived, how they coped with the trauma, whether they could ever resume anything resembling a normal life, remained a matter of speculation. The men identified as GRU officers were charged in absentia by British authorities, but there was no realistic prospect of extradition. They remained out of reach, protected by the state that had sent them. In Salisbury, the long process of cleanup and recovery unfolded over months and years. Contaminated sites were decontaminated or demolished. Businesses that had been closed for extended periods struggled to regain customers. Residents grappled with the psychological impact of knowing that their streets, their parks, and their public spaces had been the stage for a chemical weapons attack. Community support networks formed, and local authorities worked to reassure the public, but trust, especially in the invisible safety of everyday environments, had been shaken. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was deeply personal. Those close to Dawn Sturgis mourned a loss that felt both random and profoundly unjust. She had not chosen to enter the world of espionage or geopolitics. She had simply encountered a discarded object that, in any other context, would have been harmless. Support services and compensation schemes attempted to address the material consequences, but they could not fully repair the emotional damage. For first responders and medical staff, there was pride in having saved lives under extraordinary circumstances, tempered by the knowledge that they themselves had been placed at risk by an invisible, odorless toxin. The people of Salisbury, meanwhile, developed a quiet resilience, determined not to let their city be defined solely by the attack, even as it became a reference point in discussions of modern security threats. In the years that followed, the Skripal case continued to reverberate through legal, diplomatic, and security circles. International arrest warrants were issued for the suspects, and law enforcement agencies around the world were alerted to their identities and methods. Organizations responsible for monitoring chemical weapons strengthened their procedures, refining the ways in which suspicious incidents were investigated and attributed. Intelligence services revisited their assumptions about the safety of defectors and former agents living abroad, re-evaluating protection measures and the potential reach of hostile states. Debates intensified over how to deter such attacks through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, covert responses, or new forms of international accountability. Some argued that only clear and costly consequences could prevent future uses of banned weapons. Others warned that escalation might further destabilize already tense relationships. Yet many questions remained unresolved. How high within the Russian state did the authorization for the operation go? Were there other, undiscovered caches of dangerous substances left behind? Could similar attacks be prevented in the future? Or had a new, more permissive era of covert conflict begun? The Skripal affair illuminated the vulnerabilities of open societies, where everyday spaces could become targets, and where the tools of warfare could be smuggled in under the guise of tourism and trade. It also revealed the limits of existing international mechanisms designed to enforce norms against chemical weapons use. In the end, the story of Salisbury was about more than a single bench in a quiet English park. It was about power projected across borders, about the thin line between peace and hostility in an interconnected world, and about the enduring shadow of old rivalries in a century that had hoped to leave them behind. As the cathedral spire once again presided over a town striving for normality, the lesson lingered. The battlegrounds of modern conflict are not always distant frontiers. Sometimes they are the streets we walk every day, the places we think we know, and the lives that, without warning, are pulled into the hidden struggles